Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch title is Performance in the Cloud, Managing the Risk in Outsourcing. Today's Learning Lunch is sponsored by Netgain Hosting. Netgain is a health IT service provider that offers HIPAA-compliant cloud computing without losing control or risking security. We'll have more information about Netgain later, but you can learn more at www.netgainhosting.com. Before we begin, let me go over some quick housekeeping notes. Remember that you can ask questions of our presenter at any time during today's session by entering them into your chat area. In the second half of our presentation, we'll address as many questions as time allows. If we do run out of time and we don't get to your question, we'll send those questions on to our presenter and he can answer them via email after the event. Also, remember that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of the event. So people always ask us if they can get a copy of the slides, and I think that'll be true for this presentation. It's a very interesting topic. Rest assured that we'll send out that information to you after the event. All right, well, let's introduce our expert today. We're joined today by Matt Riley, the Vice President of Operations at Netgain. Matt has a wealth of experience in HIT and cloud computing, and we're pleased to share his expertise with you today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get into our presentation. Then we've got a lot to cover today. And, to begin, why don't you just set the stage for understanding the topic today?
Sure, Brian. So what we've set up today is kind of an overview, a practical look at how the cloud and its offerings in clinical IT fare under performance scrutiny. We are going to take a decidedly performance slanted view of the cloud, although that leads us to talk about a lot of emerging trends, technology, and thinking about the cloud in general. And we're going to end with some practical tips on contractual interaction with vendors, the evaluation process, how to deal with responses from vendors, hoping to leave participants today with some genuinely useful tips they can use, either on the vendor side if they are working as a vendor, or more importantly on the client side if they're advising a practice or working with a clinical administrator.
So where do the benefits of the cloud emerge then?
So the first aspect that people always go to is cost, reduction of cost, and that's what is by and large driving the movement to the cloud. When we get to clinical IT and we start talking about moving things like the electronic health record into the cloud, we need to look at some of the other benefits. Resiliency and availability. The way that clinical practice has moved to a more 24/7 by 365 operation. Risk management, the regulatory community, the compliance community, the involvement of the federal government, and some of the compliance activities of the last 5 years have raised the bar on risk. And some of those risks have simply driven in-house computing to the edge of viability, and the cloud is a useful alternative and is even arguably emerging as a predominant model. And then lastly, staffing and management. Clinical IT has become horrendously more complex with the advent of EHR, and sometimes clinics have issues dealing with retention. We deal with clinics that are in difficult geography. That can be either urban settings where we have significantly competitive markets, or it can be rural settings where we have a talent drain. And so staffing and management is one benefit that the cloud seems to address. And there are limitations to that argument, and then there are significant aspects to discuss.
Well, that's interesting. We see some of this from more of a HIPAA perspective, and I have to say, so many of those issues are easily resolved if you're using your EHR in the cloud. So I'm sure we'll get into that more as we go along here.
Right, right.
So what's the value argument then for providers to use the cloud?
So the cloud-based deployment of an EHR, at this point in the evolution of the EHR, we see a tremendously complex software environment. We are no longer talking about single titles that can reside on a single server in the back room of a small clinic, or even in the larger clinic where we have titles that don't interoperate but are relatively simple to run in-house. We simply have too much complexity, meaningful use, clinical workflow adaptation and evolution, interoperability. These are all factors of complexity that have driven the software to a point where running it without additional staff, running it without significant underlying systems is is impossible, and so you're faced with the expense of those systems. Secondarily, then, growth management and uncertainty. Medical practice is in a time of consolidation. Providers are joining together. Larger practices are gobbling up smaller practices. Consultants are faced with helping practices either become larger or be swallowed up or do the swallowing. That growth management, when added to the fact that the EHR is now growing in size, keep in mind that many practices might have 5, 6, 10 years of patient record keeping under their belt. That growth management and the uncertainty of sizing of the environment is again driving the movement to a system that has a little bit more flexibility and scalability. And then lastly, security. And we'll see these played out in some numbers that we're going to share here in a moment. But security now and as it evolves in the future, there's emerging threats. There's increasing stricture in the environment. The federal government has upped the ante tremendously just in the last 5 years with the regulatory threats to a practice who either exposes medical records to the public or in some ambiguous circumstances, medical practices that interact with external billers that then they have to share that responsibility. So the security involvement, the security environment is extremely complex.
So how popular is the cloud becoming with healthcare providers?
Yeah, good question. This is kind of a credibility building slide for the discussion. Why are we talking about this? Is healthcare moving to the cloud? Now, these are figures from CDW. This is from their State of the Cloud report, and it's dated 2013, but it's still very, very useful. CDW in this study identified that healthcare was a lagging adopter of this technology. In other words, many other industries are moving forward much faster than healthcare. And what we see interestingly here is we do see a movement. We see the panel on the right there. We see the expectation that the percentage of budget that's going to be gobbled up by cloud-based offerings is increasing. We also see some interesting factors about who are making these decisions. And because a lot of the audience today are, in some cases, consultants that are working with medical practice, pay specific attention to who's making that cloud decision. The physicians, the providers, are often not yet in this decision-making process. That is changing very, very rapidly. And part of that, if you look at that 67% number, that 47% number, cloud adoption is being driven by the consumerization of the market. In other words, the provider's getting more comfortable with the idea that they've got their personal photos or their iPhone content or anything else in the cloud, and so they're bringing that familiarity with the cloud into the medical practice and starting to drive adoption. But it's notable that it is lagging. This industry has a little bit of time where other industries have rushed to the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about those bottom numbers, the biggest impeding factors, in just a moment.
So you've touched on some of this, but where do risks emerge when we're talking about cloud computing for healthcare?
Sure. So the performance risk is obviously what we're focusing on today. The security risk we've also hit on. I want to talk a little bit about availability. Providers are now always charting. They're charting at home. They're charting from hospitals. They're charting within clinic. They're charting on Saturday, and they're sometimes charting on Sunday. Medical practice has become a 24/7 by 365. Now, that identifies an availability risk. It also has direct impact on our performance discussion because keeping a software environment available and performant is sometimes these are sometimes at odds. Very often we keep an environment performant by taking it offline at times and tweaking and performing maintenance and doing the things that IT shops do. That becomes more difficult when we're talking about a high availability environment. And of course, in medical practice, we want all of these things. The last risk there is of capture or exit. When you move the medical record off-site, when you move it to another provider, how do I get out as a medical practice? If 50% of practices, as recently surveyed, are now looking at a next-generation EMR, a vast number of medical practices are going to exit their current medical records platform. What is my risk if I put my medical records platform in the cloud, either with the EHR provider or with an independent third-party cloud provider, and then have to exit? Where's the ownership of the data? And a little bit later in the presentation, we talk about how that has impact on your initial service level agreement discussions with the provider and your contractual discussions. We have a nightmare scenario that's played out with a client we're working with right now whose exit scenario was so ambiguous in their previous provider that essentially they were left to work it out after they gave notice of their exit, which decidedly changes the leverage they had for that discussion.
So what are some growing concerns that providers should understand?
So here's the way the data breaks down in terms of what are people concerned with, what are the providers concerned with. So security still leads the pack, and there's a completely separate webinar to talk about the security of the cloud, and obviously here this is the leading concern. But secondarily, the performance of cloud services. Now, it's interesting to note that in our own history, our company started as a pure play application service provider. And I'll say that 14 years ago, when people were looking at off-site computing, typically their expectation was that this was a means to achieve a more performant environment. In other words, by moving that software environment to a hoster, as we were known years ago, that we could access greater degree of performance. Now what's happened is with the last couple of years, let's say the last 5 years of cloud evolution, the expectation is turned on its head, and it's come to be known as a cost trade-off, that by spending less, we are going to get less performance. We're going to move our environment into the cloud, and we're going to be sharing resources with some unknown number of other medical practices. That creates this concern, and thus this webinar, we want to talk a little bit about how to mitigate those threats, what kinds of questions you can ask in a contractual process and when you're vetting a vendor.
So yeah, please go ahead and tell us, when do practices seek benefits from the cloud? When are they making this move?
Sure. So this kind of the last slide discussed the why. This kind of discusses the when. When do practices tend to make this jump? What's the driver for the decision making? We did an interesting survey that kind of tends to validate some of the last slide. In this survey that you see from September, just earlier this month, we surveyed providers. This was strictly physicians, and relatively unscientific process, just a survey of a small group of physicians at an event. But here we saw really predominantly a concern about performance. Secondarily, interface, click counts, supports, and access. But they were very concerned. This cloud-based EHR slows me down. When do they turn to the cloud in the first instance? Their in-house implementation of their EMR has performance issues. Maybe this is the result of an upgrade. Maybe it's the result of the move from meaningful use stage 1 to stage 2 compliance, and suddenly the application is bogged down and charting is incredibly slow, and we've got providers walking into the hallway threatening abandonment. We might be struggling to find or retain specialized IT staff. We talked a little bit about the complexity earlier, the fact that these EHRs are now made up of multiple moving parts, not simple software as perhaps billing applications in the past were. The EHR is now a mix of imaging software. It's a mix of diagnostic inputs, of libraries of content that are fed in, and interactions between those softwares. This requires staffing that goes beyond the one-man show, the jack of all trades, or even in larger practices where the IT staff might be 3, 4, or 5 deep, they may not have the infrastructure specialists required to understand the underlying performance environment. Thirdly, they might be looking at that pending investment into IT infrastructure. The practice may be looking at a $300,000, $400,000 investment in the EHR that comes with it a $250,000 or $500,000 investment into the IT infrastructure. For a small practice, this can still be an $80,000, $100,000 question by the time they deal with issues of data replication and all the things that are needed to make that data environment safe. And lastly, the look to the cloud may come when they're discussing a new EHR, whether they're late to the game and just getting to the point where they're adopting an EHR, or whether they're looking at their second or unfortunately, in some cases, even third-generation EHR. The market is churning. What we thought was a bubble several years ago has turned into a second bubble of practices looking at new EHRs, and very often that generates a look to platform.
Well, that makes perfect sense, and I have to say we've certainly heard from many practices that is how they're moving into the cloud. They're looking at a new EHR and looking at this opportunity to be done with all the hassles associated with servers, et cetera, and make the most out of the cloud. So this is a very interesting presentation, in my humble opinion. If you do have questions for our presenter, you can go ahead and ask those now. We will save those for the end of our presentation. For now, we're just going to move on, but please do feel free to ask your questions. Okay, so tell us about how the cloud fits into IT operations.
Sure. So this is a useful slide, and this is an extremely detailed slide that represents what's called the OSI stack. And the OSI stack is a very technical concept that's intended just to show the layers of delivering software to a user. I'm not intending to use it here for any deep dive technically, but what I want to show you is that the typical cloud scope, which overlays only 3 components of what we typically see in a software delivery. And Brian, if you want to advance that. The typical cloud scope generally only handles 3 layers of delivering software. You still need to be concerned with that limitation in scope and the other 2 areas that you need to address. We move our software into the cloud, and now we have to deal with network. Network is a major component of the performance of an EHR placed in the cloud. And we'll talk a little bit later. We have some details later about questions to ask of your cloud provider related to network, but it's usually a separate scope. When we get to some differentiation between public and private cloud, we will talk a little bit about how network can be brought within the scope of the cloud provider. And then lastly, in terms of scope, there's an application scope. Most cloud providers, even the EHR providers that offer a cloud-based solution, often segregate the application support or the application expertise from the underlying infrastructure support of the cloud. We've seen that with some really, really large titles in the market where they are essentially 2 different companies. Supporting the application and supporting the underlying infrastructure is 2 different things. For the attendees on the call today, the important thing to note is that when you move your EHR to the cloud or your client's EHR to the cloud, you have additional scope to discuss, and that scope should be discussed with the cloud service provider. We want to know their answer to how do I support network, how do I support application. You want to know how far you can push those scopes into your cloud provider.
You mentioned public and private clouds before. What are the difference between these 2 things?
Sure. So this is industry parlance now for segregating 2 very different ways of handling large shared resources. Public clouds we're going to think of as the very large cloud platforms that focus on dramatic economies of scale by sharing resources across broad arrays of users, and typically putting us into environments where we may see other tenants, or we may feel the effects of other tenants in the system. Listed here, there's typically a more limited SLA on the platform itself. The platform is a broad platform serving hundreds of thousands of users, and so we have broad SLA statements, and typically not things that can be modified on a client-by-client basis.
And just for people who, I'm sorry to interrupt, just for people who may be confused, the SLA is essentially the contract that governs the implementation or the use of the cloud? Just to lay that out for us.
Yeah, good point. I'm sorry. The SLA is a component of the contract, the service level agreement, and we'll talk about the 3 critical parts of a cloud contract in just a bit, but the SLA, the service level agreement, is typically where you're going to define how should this perform. What are the performance aspects I want to guarantee in the platform in which I'm enrolling?
Thank you for that. Please continue.
You bet. Moving down the line on the public cloud, change control. Change control becomes difficult. Change control is the discipline by which we control how things are done to the environment. Upgrades are made, changes are introduced, fixes are put in place. And in a public cloud, these tend to be much more broad brush. The platform is large and monolithic, meaning that if, for instance, and they're one of the largest cloud providers in the United States, in the world actually, just announced within the last week that they're going to be rebooting instances on their public cloud. And there is no opportunity to sit out that reboot or to have your resources not be a part of that reboot. They're doing it to correct a security vulnerability. And every server hosted on that platform will be rebooted within the next couple of days in certain windows. That's the impact of a broad brush change control platform. You're often limited on access vehicles, meaning in a public cloud, you may have access from the browser, you may have access to your mobile platform, but you may not have a lot of other flexibility in terms of how you plug into whatever application you put on that public cloud. And your exit strategy may be less defined. because the resource is large and shared. Perhaps you're in an application that has 100 other practices using it in tandem, and you're just one little carve-out of that application. Your exit strategy is difficult. It's typically a here's your data approach. Here's a drive. Your data is dumped onto it. We expect you to take the next step and to figure out what to do with your data. This contrasts with the private cloud. The private cloud is what the market has started to understand is how we carve out shared resources, but we build security boundaries. We build more flexibility for individual clinics, still taking advantage of significant economies, but putting boundaries around it that allow us to make more discrete decisions on a clinic-by-clinic basis. So with that, we get more specific service level agreements. Sometimes you can tinker with the service level agreement. You can make requests like specialized maintenance windows. Our clinic is open on Sunday morning, but we're closed on Sunday afternoon, so we want our maintenance window to be Sunday afternoon, for example. These are often constructed, these private clouds, to look more like an extension of the clinic's closet. They may actually use the security environment from the clinic and extend it right into the cloud, making it seem as if what we really hired is a private data center. That's not to be confused with off-site co-location or buying a bunch of hardware and putting it into a co-location center. What we're talking about is still a virtual environment that is not owned by the clinic but rented, but carved out to look like an extension of the closet. Because it's more discrete and more specific to the clinic, the access vehicles are more varied. If we have providers that are going in and out of our local hospitals, and the hospitals require a Citrix vehicle, that's a specific software that's used to access a platform, we might be able to plug that in because we've got discrete resources. If we need to support a different browser because that some other software requires that browser within the clinic, if we need to support a mobility platform from Apple or from any, maybe we need to have some support from a specific tablet, we can change up those access vehicles and be a little bit more specific and varied. Typically, these are more costly because you are limiting some of the economies of scale by carving it out for the clinic, but they dramatically lower risk. And the exit strategy is more defined. It is easier to pull your data out of a private cloud because it is already discrete. Very often, it's within your security environment. Think for any people that are on the line that know IT architecture, Active Directory is how Windows defines a security environment. Many private clouds will simply take the clinic's Active Directory and move it right into the cloud. And so then the exit strategy is getting your data, lighting up your application in a different cloud or in a private environment, and then migrating your data back, but you don't have big user workflow changes because you don't have to change the underlying security.
All right, well, that all makes sense to me. So let's look at a case study then of what it looks like if an EHR moves from, their own space into a public cloud environment.
Sure. So, Brian, we've got two cases to describe in brief here. One is a recent example. The client had a significant in-house investment that was aging. We're talking about a 5-year-old architecture supporting the same EHR that they were moving into the cloud to support. So we have continuity of the EHR, but we had eroding staff retention. This clinic was seeing staff that had been on board at the beginning of the EHR deployment leave the practice. They were taking all that experience with them, and that was having significant impact on downtime and availability and provider confidence in the platform. They decided to move to an EHR vendor-based public cloud. So this would be internet accessible only via VPN. So it's secure. It answered a lot of security questions, but it required the clinic to embark on a program of upgrading their internet connection. They had to buy a very, very significant pipe to the internet to support this. And then there were all of the questions that we'll talk about when you introduce an internet connection between the provider and their EHR. Now, their initial performance challenges left a lot of ambiguity here. Right out of the gate, this was a practice that saw a lot of slowness in the platform. Providers were, within the first week, threatening abandonment of the platform. And they had to do a few things. They had to upgrade the internet bandwidth to the practice, which meant recontracting with the telecom provider. They had to change the way security was being handled on that internet connection because it was introducing some slowdown. And then they had to haul the EHR provider, the EHR vendor in to talk a little bit about the support between the product and the cloud platform, because it was immediately apparent that although they were being sold under one contract, the platform staff and the EHR support staff were not talking. and that introduced a major challenge. Now, this practice is still in this EHR vendor-based public cloud. They're making a go of it. They're still not prepared to say that they're happy. This is a practice that we're consulting with, and basically we're on the client side of this interaction, helping this client adapt their service level agreement and what they're demanding of their vendor.
Well, and that speaks to the levels you talked about before in your chart that was complicated, but the point you were making is when you see the practical application here that the cloud folks and the EHR folks are not the same people, that's an interesting illustration of that.
Yeah, and in that case, it really felt almost like they were dealing with two vendors, and the opportunity to have, quote, one throat to choke, which is really what that administrator was looking for, and that's why he was using that platform, that really broke down in the first week as they discovered that they had to work to bring two different houses, two different sides of the house into one meeting room from the same vendor.
Interesting. All right, well, let's look at a private cloud environment.
Sure. So this is a clinic that went a little bit different route. They looked at both the EHR vendor-sponsored public cloud, and they also looked at an independent cloud vendor. They ended up deploying within a more privatized cloud. They were deploying one of the top 10 solutions within the EHR space, so a title that's very well known to a lot of the attendees today. They see segregated network space, a server farm that is completely independent. It incorporates their own security or Active Directory architecture. So this is that deployment we talked about a few minutes ago that looks like an extension of their own server closet. And in this case, one of the hallmarks of the private cloud, private telecom, was fully supported. So in this case, the providers and staff of the multiple clinic sites involved here access the cloud vendor over private leased lines. That is where a lot of additional expense is incurred, and why private clouds tend to be a premium over public clouds. We're not using internet. We may be using internet just for failover as a backup, but primarily we're using private telecom. So these are connections where we have, for example, 10 megabits per second to the data center, to the cloud provider. And a lot of the larger cloud providers simply don't offer it. Also in this case study, scalable resources unique to the clinic. So their contract specifies, in this case, what their resources cost, and as the application evolves over time, they're able to ratchet up or down those resources contractually to answer the needs of the application. It's scalable performance, which again is one of the markers of the clinical private cloud. They still have remaining challenges. So this title in particular is one that's evolving very quickly. It's answering meaningful use challenges. And so they see performance ebb and flow with every change control that comes from the EHR vendor, but they are a little bit more attuned to how their resources respond and what resources they have to throw at the application because they have that control and they're in this private cloud. I'm going to say that in both of these case studies, we have, the jury is out. They're both underway currently. I would say in the private cloud, and obviously I'm a purveyor of and a supporter of private clouds, but in that case, that party has more control of the underlying performance environment.
So I guess we've assumed that it can, but can the cloud really handle mission-critical applications like an EHR?
Sure, and I would argue that the market is becoming mature enough that we can move mission-critical apps to the cloud. What has had to become more mature are the service level agreements. They have to reflect the strictures of HIPAA, SSAE 16, what the Office of the National Coordinator says, Department of Health and Human Services. The SLA has had to move from becoming a technical document to a clinically relevant document, and that's the evolution of the cloud that makes it mate well with the EHR, and we're getting there. I would argue that private clouds have gotten there faster, that it's very, very difficult to responsibly move an electronic health record into a public shared cloud and answer some of the strictures of those regulatory environments I listed. Also, growth management and uncertainty. Again, now the market is maturing to the point where we are giving the buyers of cloud applications access to the growth management tools. We're giving them contractually the ability to grow the environment at their discretion versus at some unknown rate that the provider feels is necessary. So cost controls that go with that growth management are placed in the hands of the buyer, and that's a maturity model that we we really hadn't arrived at until probably the last 3 or 4 years. And then security, which we keep coming back to and mentioning security, and like I said, that's an entirely separate topic to discuss. But the security environment, the incorporation of dual-factor authentication models that still fit with the performance model. Keep in mind that security and performance typically are counterweights. When we introduce more security, we very often slow down the environment. We need them both. And the cloud has gotten to the point where many offerings are out there for security models that don't drag on performance of the EHR.
So we talked before about what a service level agreement is. What should providers know about contracting and the SLA?
Sure. So here, I guess what I'd like to, if we leave the audience with practical tips today, it's probably going to surround vendor vetting and contracting in a private cloud environment. There are really 3 components to the contractual environment, and I don't have a slide for this necessarily, but those 3 components are the services agreement, the underlying contract for services, and that's going to define the term and the commit. And I would argue that buyers need to be very careful to not lock themselves into long-term cloud arrangements. We see too many 5-year contracts in a market that's churning so quickly that the options for improvement are out there in 18 to 24 months. So the core agreement needs to see some caution. The second component is that SLA, the service level agreement. That is a component of the contract that needs to stand on its own and really define the technical underpinnings of the performance environment. The third then, and this often gets overlooked, is there needs to be some sort of a pricing agreement, and it needs to be a discrete pricing agreement that is attached to that contract and attached to that SLA that explains, in order to hit this service level agreement for this term of contract, we are going to deploy the following resources at the following cost. And those costs should be discrete enough and directly tied to performance such that they allow the buyer to understand how they're going to ratchet up both the resources and the expense over time.
So how do providers mitigate the risk in the SLA then?
So this is a really broad topic, but just very specifically, this is a challenge for small practices with limited buying capacity. The average cloud service provider is going to want to drop a one-size-fits-all, one-model-fits-all service level agreement in front of you. And for a small practice making a limited spend buy in the cloud, you may be forced to live with that SLA or evaluate something more private, more of a private cloud. Now, where you do have flexibility, mating software specifications and performance to the delivery over the life of the agreement, how are resources metered? What am I buying? Are they metered as such? Are those directly tied to performance? And we are going to get into some nuts and bolts here with the next couple of slides, but when we're talking about service level, are my nuts and bolts identified in the agreement? And do I have a guarantee that if my EHR title changes its approach to nuts and bolts, if it requires something more, am I guaranteed that I'll be able to hit those minimum specifications? Is there evolution built into the document? When leverage does exist, what are you looking to guarantee? The service level agreement may lead you into availability, and they may want to talk about availability, but availability may be table stakes. I assume you can keep this application up 24/7 by 365, but I want to talk about performance in the SLA. What measures exist to talk about performance? And then very importantly, when I'm looking at the SLA, what are we talking about that's included, and what is simply guaranteeing something that's going to give me more cost? When I ask for it, it's going to increase the cost. And so identifying those cost drivers, and again, that's why I like to advise clients, you need to have a pricing agreement bolted into your master service agreement. You have to understand how pricing increments with performance. Lastly on this slide, defining cause. Tying cause, which generally cause is defined as a reason to exit a contract, a reason for termination. How do we tie cause to performance? Can we make the performance of the environment cause to either invoke penalty or to exit the agreement if we are looking for an entirely different arrangement? And then getting competent review, both legal, technical, and procedural review.
So please continue then. What's the risk of oversubscription?
So oversubscription, this is where we really start to get into kind of the nuts and bolts. We'll talk a little bit about the economics of oversubscription. Oversubscription generally is taking a group of resources that could be used by X number of users and deploying them across X plus Y users, because we know they're going to be using them at different rates over different times. And this is part of why we get economies from the cloud, is that we sell cloud resources assuming that utilization is across the board, and we can sell some of these resources in such a fashion that we might have only 30% utilization or 40% utilization at any given time. If we move to the next slide, there's some good illustration here, and the power and utility company model is helpful. There was a book that I would recommend to anybody who wants to learn more about the oversubscription model. Nick Carr wrote a book, The Big Switch, where he used the power company or the utility company to illustrate oversubscription. At the turn of the last century, companies had to deploy their own power generators if they were using electricity in their manufacturing. But it became obvious that you could build power companies that would absorb entire cities full of electrical consumption, and because manufacturers and factories and homes were using power differently at different times, we could build a power company that might churn out X number of megawatts, and that might serve a number of users that collectively would take many more than that, but they're using the resource at different times. So to apply that in the IT context, we've got this little graph where we show you an IT resource that's maybe only used 10 or 25% of on average. If we move to the next slide, what we'll see illustrated there is what cloud providers do is they take many of those assets, those workloads, those EHRs, they put them under one roof, and then they take the underlying resources and they push them to greater utilization. So the practice that you're working with may be commingled in a cloud environment with another practice and another practice and 100 other practices, all of whom are only using a fragment of their computing power and at different times of the day, and the cloud providers carve that up to increase the utilization over the entire resource. This is fundamental to understanding why the cloud can be a cost saver, but it's also a harbinger of caution when we start talking about performance. We don't want to see our cloud provider oversubscribe to the point where we suffer performance problems.
Absolutely, and I love that you're so into the nuts and bolts here, because it's really explaining why this is a concern.
And the next slide kind of starts, and again, this isn't a technical presentation, but I want the audience to understand when we talk about the data center, we're talking traditional technical elements like processors, RAM, and disk, the hard drives on which our EHR is stored. These are all performance drivers, and we should see some of these reflected in the SLA. Now, at the very outset, when you're deploying an EHR, hardware readiness, the ability to say that the EHR's requirements are met by the hardware that underlies your cloud, that's hardware readiness, and your EHR will require that you meet it. In some models where the EHR is selling you a private cloud to support their own software, oddly enough, they will not be held contractually to the same kind of hardware readiness they would require if you were hosting with a third party. So that hardware readiness and the contractual environment surrounding it deserves some attention. And then over time, faster hardware. How do we tap into faster hardware? Processors get faster, RAM gets faster, disk changes. What's in the agreement about accessing either latest and greatest, or what you're more likely to see is minimum standards? There's a little bit to be said here in terms of disk and the mysteries of input-output, IOPS. Again, not going too deep here, but disk is the new performance metric in the cloud. Many EHR titles are moving to a model where they won't allow oversubscription of RAM and processors. In other words, if my software requires 16 processors and 32 gigs of RAM, that's what I'll have to have committed, and my cloud provider can't oversubscribe it. But disk, there's emerging technology in disk that offers greater performance, and you need to see that discussed in the service level agreement. This goes very deep, and I'm going to go back to an earlier slide where I said having qualified review of your SLA and understanding how disk plays into it is critical.
So it's the upshot is that people are beginning to adopt solid-state disks in these cloud environments for faster I/O times. Is that it?
That's right. That's exactly right. And we have a graph that ends the presentation today that will show you kind of how that's playing out. But solid-state disk, if you jot down a technical concept to learn something more about today, solid-state disk is something to look into, because it is going to change the underlying storage of the EHR in the next 18 months.
So
On
tell
the
us about the
network.
network. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, the network, the internet, latency by definition. When you run an EHR over the internet, latency is the pause you see as that network connection moves across the country. And desktops and browsers respond very differently to latency. One of the tips I'll offer you is if you're moving your practice to a cloud and you're going to be connecting to it over the internet, find out what is on net. What are the network connections that are supported by that cloud provider directly? And when you talk to your own internet service provider, evaluate how close they are on the network to each other. This is a way of taking an internet connection and turning it very close to private performance just by evaluating who you should be buying your internet from. This really takes technical assistance to understand this, but it can be done. And we have projects that we've been involved with where we're buying telecom in California, mating it to a data center in Minnesota, but we're making the two very close to on-net by buying internet, in a smart way. And then the private network, is it available? Can you buy private network to this private cloud? Can it be cost effective? And do we still have last mile challenges? Are we going to have a $20,000 upgrade to our clinic to be able to get a 10 megabit connection that allows us to outsource the EHR?
Please go on. User delivery.
Yep. So in user delivery, when you're talking to the cloud provider, we want to know, do they support ubiquitous delivery? Do they support a number of different avenues for getting this to the users? Desktops, laptops, tablets, mobiles. Do they support only specific models or specific environments? And does the cloud provider have delivery expertise and flexibility? So are they actually giving you the tools and the toolkit to deliver that EHR or that cloud environment to the user, or are they washing their hands at the edge of the network and saying, it's a cloud offering, you deliver it to your laptops the way you want to deliver it to your laptops? The involvement of the cloud provider here is what is paramount.
And in support.
This is where the fundamental imbalance in the economies of the cloud comes out. Cloud hardware is cheap, people are not. So what happens is the cloud providers don't want to bundle a support offering alongside their platform. Humans are expensive, and letting users talk to humans is even more expensive. So you often have a disconnect between the software and the platform support, and that leads to finger pointing. So lastly, how do we counteract that? We look for escalation vehicles. How do problems with the platform get identified, run up the food chain, and become, get attention from those that can mate the support offering and the platform offering, so that we're looking at any given performance problem in the context of the entire environment. So escalation vehicles and how they get built into the SLA is paramount. So here are some practical tips to when you get into that vendor vetting environment. Checking references. A lot of evaluators will simply let the cloud provider give us a list of practices that are using the solution. I'm going to suggest that you get a little bit more granular, that you talk to 3 different classes of practices that have used the solution. The long-term player, somebody who's been in the platform 2+ years, unless the platform's only recently emerged, but we're looking for somebody that's been on the platform long-term and has seen the platform evolve. We're also looking to the recently joined. We want to know, how does this cloud provider roll out? How do they implement their solution? How quickly do they bring it to the clinic? What kind of support do they have during the go-live? And then we also want to talk to the departed. This is the most difficult reference to get from a cloud service provider, but give me a reference of a clinic that has moved off your platform that I can talk to about the ease with which they exited. Very difficult to get that reference, very, very useful to talk to them.
Yeah, how would you get them? I mean, is it something you insist on, or?
It's something you insist on. If they can't tell you, if they can't give you a reference from somebody who's exited the platform that's still willing to talk to you as a reference, it's a red flag. And I know it's an unusual question, but when you're in clinical IT and you're talking about parking your medical record off-site, insist. And when you insist, they will either give you this reference or, again, you've got the red flag run up. Next, ongoing engagement. Look to find out what kind of avenues that vendor has. Do they have an advisory group? Now, as a medical practice, you may not be large enough to participate in the advisory group, but we want to know whether they have an advisory group. And then for you specifically as a practice, is there quarterly or semi-annual review? Do they sit down with you and talk performance? Is performance a part of that conversation? And then again, what is the escalation of persistent issues? What kind of task forcing does that cloud vendor have if your particular deployment of software in their particular cloud is not performance? is not performant enough for your needs.
And please go on with scope of delivery and exit plan.
Sure. So as we're talking to this vendor, we want to understand the total scope of their delivery. When we understand it's a service at the end of the wire, think back to that 7-part OSI model. What kind of access to tools do I have to present this cloud offering through my desktop? If the cloud provider doesn't offer you those tools, which is what is more common in the marketplace, then what kinds of desktop tools are supported? And we're looking for variability. We're looking for an answer. What we don't want is a blank slate. Deliver it the way you deliver it. That's a red flag. The integration to my mobility platform. How am I going to get this in the hands of mobile tablets, over wireless networks, or potentially even to smartphones? And again, we're looking to find out that there is an answer, not a blank slate. We want the cloud provider to have supported methodology. And then the depth of monitoring. How far into my network do you monitor to understand how your cloud is performing for me? Do you monitor the connection to my clinic? Can you tell me anything about my internet platform? And again, think about when your users are calling the cloud provider to say, we're having a performance issue, how far is that cloud provider going to go into diagnostics before they cut it off and say, you know, we're a platform at the end of the wire. We can't tell you anything about what's happening in your clinic. And then the exit plan. You need to discuss the exit plan. You need to talk data ownership. It is federal law that ownership of the medical record remains with the practice. We want to know that that law is reflected in ease of contractual exit, that it's very clear that if I need to exit the cloud, there are defined methodologies for getting my data. What are the contingencies for acquisition, for merger, if we have a BAA violation or good faith dispute? All of these things should be in the contract, and some of them do have direct ties back to performance.
So tell us about how technology is responding to this issue. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. So, you know, data centers are filling with traditional spinning disk. As EHRs become more mature, we've got many more medical records, imagery, interfaces. The software now combs through millions of records to cross-reference. Just producing a work list or contraindicated pharma, this takes the application of lots of processing power. So we had old bottlenecks, which were processor, RAM, network. We've talked a little bit about each of those. The new bottleneck, and again, one of the technical tidbits that I want to leave the audience with is disk. Disk is changing. Cloud providers now offer tiered levels of disk. You either buy the fastest disk at the highest dollar, or you buy the slowest disk because it's archival. The important thing to understand is that the cloud is achieving cost savings in some cases by delivering slower disk, but you may not always be talking about it on the front end. So you want the very front end discussion with your cloud provider to talk about how do you present disk, what different levels of performance do you offer? Because input-output, the ability of disk to deliver those millions of records up to the processor is the new bottleneck in performance.
Well, and any of those... Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Brian.
I was just going to say any of those of us at home who have moved to flash drives in our own computers know that it makes a big difference.
Right, and that flash technology is one of the most important developments. Now, flash is hit the consumer level. Everybody's carrying it around in their iPhone or their smartphone or even in your desktop at home. But moving flash to a point where we can store millions of records on it safely and replicate it and store it in large data centers, that's been where the industry has lagged. This graph shows you the blue line is what happens when we take traditional old-style hard drives and we load them up with lots of IOPS, input-outputs. We have lots of EHR interaction, and latency goes up. The disk slows down.
And
whereas
so
what you're talking about...
Latency here is just how long it takes the disk to deliver the data to the processor. Is that it?
That's exactly right. You should teach the course. That's a great definition. It's how long to get it from the disk to my eyeballs.
Okay.
And what you'll see on the bottom there is flash or solid-state disk. This newer technology really doesn't have that performance trade-off. So I'm going to tie this back to our cloud platform. When you start talking to your cloud provider and you're talking about building that private cloud for the clinical practice, what are we using to store the medical record? Do we have multiple tiers of disk that we can buy to keep costs down? And am I getting the benefits of technology that flattens out that curve? So that once I've been hosting with you 3 years and I have 500,000 medical records under your roof with all the imagery associated with it, that I'm not suffering performance problems.
So to conclude, what should our audience take away from this session?
So the cloud's not going away. I think we can say that. Cloud providers are showing significant service gains. There are cost savings. You can argue whether the medical practice enjoys those cost savings or whether the stricture of medical practice means that this is really more of a service gain industry. But the cloud's definitely not going away. So you have to understand the constituent parts and how they impact performance. You have to crawl into the nuts and bolts, and you have to make sure that they're reflected either in contract or in monitoring in what's presented to you as a user. You have to have visibility to the constituent parts. And definition of that client-vendor relationship at every level is imperative. So the cloud service provider can't simply be a service at the end of the wire. It's not a magazine subscription. It's a subscription to a highly complex environment, and we have to have lots of definition about how we interact with it. One of the pieces of advice I give when a client is negotiating an SLA is look for the human in the technology. You've got to have some human interaction built into the technical platform. That's either advisory sessions, it's an escalation vehicle, it's some means of choking that throat, for example, reaching out to the cloud provider and saying, it's not performing, we need to interact, and that needs to be built into the contract.
Choking that throat when it needs to be choked.
That's right. That's right. So look for the bullet on the contract that says definition of throat choking.
That's right. Well, we've saved some time here at the end for questions from our audience, so if you've been holding those, please share them. We've already got a couple questions. But before we get into those, I just have to say, Matt, that I always learn from our learning lunches, but I really found this to be really fascinating because we hear so much about the cloud, and I know so many practices are moving to the cloud, but to get this level of detail on what you actually need to expect from cloud services and to do your due diligence and to be sure that your SLA covers all these things was really, to me, just wonderful to get that level of detail, and I'm sure it has to be useful to folks out there who are considering making this move. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope for some good discussion.
All right, well, let's get some questions from our audience. Okay, so this question is a good one. How can costs build up through a vague SLA? So I think they're trying to say, like, how can, support costs and that sort of thing, if it's not covered by the SLA, what is the danger there?
Yeah, well, so I'm going to go back to, my earlier stricture that you've got to have a very detailed pricing agreement associated with your cloud offering. Where the ambiguity comes in is when you don't have that pricing agreement and it doesn't have strict definition of the resources underlying performance, then what happens is over time the software gets heavier, meaningful use requirements are introduced, security requirements are introduced, and the software just gets larger and potentially slower. None of the top 20 EHR titles in the nation are without their performance nightmares in the last 3 years dealing with meaningful use. And so without the understanding of what happens to the individual nuts and bolts in the SLA as that software gets heavier, then support costs creep up. Because in order to maintain the level of performance and not see exit of their clients, the cloud provider is forced to throw those resources at the practice, and of course those have costs. We simply want to understand what those costs are on the front end. I tell clients, expect escalation of costs over the years, but expect controlled escalation. Part of the cloud is just control of that growth and expenditure.
Okay. Here's a question about backing up cloud data. The question is there any way for us to physically back up cloud data in-house? I have not had any luck getting an answer to this question. Accessing patient data during downtimes of the EMR would be helpful in the clinic, as well as give us peace of mind on ensuring we always have data.
Really, really excellent question. So I'm gonna give this 3 levels. One, there absolutely should be backup consideration and data replication within the scope of the cloud environment. So the cloud provider should owe you backup within their environment. What the participant's really asking though is, if I don't trust the connectivity or the cloud provider is inaccessible, how can I have those records sitting on site? And this is much easier in a private cloud than a public cloud, but both models offer some avenue for replicating data on-site within the clinic. You just have to push your provider to give you those avenues. They will almost always have additional cost. There are modules in some of the large EHR titles that will replicate data into similar modules that are provided by the EHR vendor that sit at the clinic and are a repository for that data. Now, the third layer that I'll give you, though, is the caution that these medical records, if they could be made easily accessible and they could operate under your roof effectively and with high performance, then we wouldn't see as many people moving to the cloud. It's very difficult to move an entire mass of medical records in-house and make it useful. So typically what we're talking about is maybe a week's worth of diagnostic data and patient visits that's kept on site to allow us to at least run front desk and current diagnostic procedures in-house. These are supportable, but you're going to have to push to get them because they typically add something to the environment that will bring additional cost.
So that arrangement isn't typical, you would say?
I don't think it's typical, but the request is becoming more prevalent. We've certainly seen it, and I would say that you're going to see a lot more flexibility in models. We support this in a limited number of environments today. It is almost always with additional cost. So certainly it's not an included feature today, and it's not table stakes.
All right. Well, I think we have time for maybe another question or two. This question is, and this might be too big of a question, but I'll share it with you anyway. You talked about security and performance being balanced. How should they be balanced?
Well, the market demands both in medical practice. The market simply won't allow a highly performant application that gets there by trading off encryption and password protection. We simply don't have an environment that allows that. So the challenge for both the software end of it, the EHR provider, but also the platform providers that want to house those EHRs is how do we quickly get providers authenticated into the platform and into the software while at the same time not sacrificing performance. They traditionally are handoff. In this market, they simply can't be. So I'll tell you that the relief valve, unfortunately, is cost. We have more expensive security models. We have more expensive means of speeding up those security models, usually by throwing more resources, faster telecom at the solution. Nobody's found the magic syrup that makes a highly secure environment perform so well that we can run it on less resources. It simply isn't out there yet.
And we do hear concerns about that sometimes from practices that we talk to. Well, I want you to take just a moment and tell us about Netgain, if you could, Matt, because the whole time you were talking, I kept thinking, if I was looking at one of these contracts, I would definitely want your help. I don't know that I'd be able to do it myself. So tell us a little bit about how Netgain can help folks with these questions.
Sure. So we've got kind of two sides to the equation. I have the benefit of having had some experience in my career, both negotiating the service level when I was on the buy side with a clinic, working on behalf of a client with a large cloud provider. I've done that a number of times. And then, of course, we are a provider of private clouds. Netgain's a 14-year-old business that has been first an application service provider back in 2000, and then we really evolved to become what you'd call a private hosting facility. And then as the market changed and we started talking about cloud resources, we've developed the kind of scale and dynamic scaling that is more typical of the cloud. How do you find somebody that can help you with these SLAs? I will tell you 90% of the time I'm on the vendor side of the SLA. So a lot of the tricks and the tips and things that I've introduced in this session have been things that if they were wielded by a client, they'd be wielded against Netgain. These are ways of buying more smartly from a provider like Netgain. Mm-hmm. But there are consultants out there, and I'm sure there are those that are on the call today who specialize in helping clinics get through the SLA and negotiate the SLA. And I never mind when I see those consultants involved in the effort because, quite honestly, we end up with a happier client long term.
Well, and you've got a quality product, so I'm sure that you're ready for a client who expects the best.
100%. Yeah, that's how I look at it, is that the stronger the SLA that I can perform to, the better I'm doing in the marketplace.
Well, I really have to thank you, Matt, because this has been, for me, a really fascinating session, and I'm sure it has been for our audience as well. If we didn't get to your question, rest assured that we'll send those on to our presenter, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them after the event. I want to thank our audience for attending as well. We are always pleased to share information with you about the cloud and HIT. Remember that all registered attendees will receive an email with links to both the slides and the video recording of this session, so we did have some people ask about that. Rest assured that you'll get those materials after this session. Again, visit Netgain Hosting if you're looking at moving to the cloud and see what their offerings can do for you. That's www.netgainhosting.com to learn more about their offerings. If you need training in meaningful use, PQRS, or HIPAA compliance, you can always visit www.formedtraining.com to access our self-paced online courses. If you prefer instructor-led workshops, that's something new we're doing here, and you can learn more about those at www.formedworkshops.com. Visit our homepage at formedapproved.com to learn more about our upcoming learning lunches. The Learning Lunch button will take you to our upcoming webinars where you can learn more and register. Our next learning lunch will air October 7th and has the title Next Steps in Meaningful Use. I'm sure everybody's a little nervous about that one. So do join us for that next learning lunch session. Keep an eye on your email box on our homepage for other upcoming topics. Thank you again for joining us, Matt. Again, a wonderful session.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.